is brought to you by the Adventist Theological Society, and I wanted to give thanks to Dr. Michael Campbell, who organized this event. So thank you very much, Michael, for your work. And we hope that this conversation will spark new ideas, and we are glad that you are
I'm glad, despite COVID and everything else, it's finally worked out to have you here. So a warm welcome. Well, I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kristen Dumais, who is a professor of history at Catherine Bushnell. She was this social reformer in the late 19th century and just an incredible individual to learn about. And I think this book helps to demonstrate both professionally and academically Dr. Dumais' deep love herself for the church and the body of Christ and her concern for discipling the next generation. So that's really amazing. And then probably what you may be more familiar with her in the afternoon is her book, the New York Times bestselling Jesus and John Wayne, that came out, 2 years ago, I think, with the subtitle, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Now, she has been featured on numerous news media outlets. I could go on and list all of those. Maybe you've heard her on NPR or featured on a number of other different places. What I want to tell you is that I think she's an intrepid historian. So I asked a good friend of mine, a mutual historian friend, who told me that one time she bravely spoke about toxic masculinity while a Trump rally was taking place outside the building where she was speaking. So, and then I think on a more personal note, she's a very avid on social media. So I love following your social media posts, and so that kind of transparency, whether it's dealing with COVID, in the classroom, all of those kinds of things, to teaching, or creating teachable moments with your own 3 children. She says that her next book is titled Live, Laugh, Love, which is going to be a cultural study of white Christian womanhood. And I look forward to that next work of hers. So welcome, Dr. Dumais, to Southwestern Adventist University as part of this lecture series. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you all for coming again on this gorgeous Sabbath afternoon, especially for somebody coming from Michigan in February. This happen, and as of 1 hour ago, I wasn't sure if this was going to be happening. I heard all these horror stories. I've been in Waco at Truett Seminary the last couple of days, and everybody's telling me about how bad I-35 is. I was like, yeah, right. I gave myself a full hour extra to get here, and I spent that full hour backed up in traffic. There's a massive accident, like Texas-style size accident. I don't know. And we, anyway, just pulled up, and I'm very pleased to be here with you all. Okay, and thank you for that introduction. And I do like bringing up the first book, and it really is. I mean, the first book I published City Press, and like most academics, you put your heart and soul into a book, maybe a decade of research or so, and maybe 500 people read it. And right. And but it really was that book. I think 2 things that brought me to a place to write Jesus and John Wayne indirectly. And one was that book. because I understood that there was a much longer history of Christian feminism that predated 1970s era feminism. And for you folks, you kind of know that. You come from a tradition that has affirmed women's to disrupt social hierarchies because they felt called by the Spirit. And what I understood there was that there are many Christians throughout history who have understood that patriarchy is not the will of God, and in fact have thought that Jesus came to overturn that. And so that, coming from a conservative tradition, and then reading the history of other actually conservative who read the scriptures differently, was informative for me. Simply knowing that you could take the Bible extremely seriously, you could even identify as a fundamentalist in the early 20th century and read the scriptures as liberating for women, that is what stuck with me. And then, I spent a year in Germany. I was in high school, and this was a long time ago, before there was social media, before there was really email. So you were actually on your own. I went to a German gymnasium. I lived with a host family, and I talked with my own family for 10 minutes once a month on the phone. So it was a whole different world. And it was so good for me because it helped me, being in another culture, helped me see my own culture with new eyes. It gave me all kinds of questions. Why do we do things this way? One of the things that I was held personally responsible for as an American was our patriotism, right? My German friends would ask me, what is it with you Americans and your flag waving, right? And I was like, wow, what's the big problem with that? And they said, don't. Right, this is from a German context. And so I came back to the United States with a whole bunch of questions and a curiosity about my own cultural formation, about my own religious tradition. So that's why I ended up becoming a history major and going off to graduate school to study not German history. I really debated, but I ended up studying American history because I just had so many questions. Okay, so I'm going to not tell you my whole life story, but I'm just going to jump to the beginnings, the origin story of Jesus and John Wayne. Where did this book come from? It goes way back, too. It goes back to my first year as a new professor teaching at Calvin. Maybe it was my second year. It was very early on. Maybe it was my second semester, first year, I think. I wasn't really taking notes because I didn't, at that time, know what this was going to lead to. I was teaching a class, a U.S. survey course, in just plain old U.S. history. But I decided to lecture one day on Teddy Roosevelt. And I did this because I wanted to show my students at Calvin University, it was just college back then, I wanted to show them how gender worked in history. Because that's what I had come to see through graduate studies. And Teddy Roosevelt is this perfect example because we can see the shift in the history of masculinity if we look at Teddy Roosevelt. And so Teddy Roosevelt, this is the Rough Rider, you might remember, right? He liked hunting, and he really kind of embodied this ideals of masculinity and femininity change over time, and that they're connected to broader shifts, to economic transformations. They're connected to foreign policy. They're connected to empire, to race, and to religion. And so I put together this nice little lecture on Teddy Roosevelt, felt pretty good about it, wrapped up the class period, and as I was pulling my notes together, a couple of students came up to me, a couple of guys from the class. There is this book that you have got to read. And that book was John Eldridge's Wild at Heart. How many of you are familiar with that book? Okay, so enough of you know what we're talking about here. So Wild at Heart was published in 2001. Now, I was teaching this class around 2005, okay? By that time, that book was everywhere in evangelical spaces, everywhere. My own church was hosting multiple book studies on it. All of the guys in their dorms were reading Wild at Heart. I had heard all about it, and I kind of rolled my eyes. Not for me, not my thing, right? I don't need to bother with that. But I took their advice. I drove down to Family Christian Bookstore, back when we still had Christian bookstores, you might remember. And I bought myself a copy for $20. I opened it up, and there was a quote from Teddy Roosevelt right up front. And I kept reading, and I saw that this vision of Christian manhood that Eldridge was putting forward was very militaristic. God is a warrior God, and men are made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. And the woman's role is passive. She does not have an adventure to live. She shares in his adventure. She is a seductress. She is to be rescued, and that is her role. And I was really struck by how, for being a vision of Christian masculinity, there were not a lot of Bible verses in this book at all. Instead, Eldridge looked to Hollywood heroes for his model of masculinity. His favorite was Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. That's his ideal of a Christian man, rugged, right, ready to mete out vengeance against one's enemies, noble, righteous violence. And I thought, this is interesting, a little bit disturbing. And now another thing you should know is that book, I said it was everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean everywhere. It sold more than 4 million copies. 4 million copies. If there are any writers in here, do a quick calculation of what that means for royalties. 4 million copies. It was everywhere. And it wasn't just that book. Because of the success of Wild at Heart, writing very similar books with the same cast of characters. Teddy Roosevelt was in there, George Patton, random cowboys and soldiers, General MacArthur. These were their heroes, and John Wayne. Now, Eldridge didn't include John Wayne, but a whole bunch of these other guys did, as the icon of Christian masculinity. And so I was reading all these, and I thought, okay, this is a lot. Kind of disturbing going on at the time. I said this is around 2005 or 2006, right? And at that time, we were in the early years of the Iraq War. And I was seeing all this survey data come my way about white evangelicals being total outliers when it came to support for the Iraq War, when it came to support for preemptive war in general, embracing an aggressive foreign policy, and condoning the use of torture. And I just asked myself, as historians of Roosevelt had asked, what might one of these things have to do with the other? This embrace of a wild, militant, warrior masculinity with actual aggression in terms of foreign policy. And so I thought, this is a super interesting project. I'm going to dig in. And I spent a year and a half researching this, reading all of those books. And then I set the project aside for a couple of reasons. One, it was incredibly wasn't sure that I wanted to spend the years of my life that I thought it would take immersing myself in that literature. And I didn't like how it made me feel about my fellow Christians, to be honest, right? And I had this nagging question because what I was reading felt incredibly extreme. Frankly, it felt extremist. And I was troubled as a Christian historian, as a Christian scholar. Is that what I ought to be doing as a Christian? Because it feels fringe, even though I'm looking at these book sales and I know everybody's reading this stuff and embracing it, and boot camps and retreats, but if it is fringe, is it right for me to shine a bright light on what might be the darkest underbelly of American Christianity? Is that what I ought to be doing here? So those were a couple of reasons, and then some more practical reasons. I had a baby. I had another baby in quick succession, and I had to finish my first book, and I just thought, you know what, I'll get back to it later, maybe someday. But I didn't stop paying attention to all these guys that I had been reading. And what I noticed over the next decade was one after another of these guys, these authors, these preachers, became implicated in scandal, in abuse of power, and often in sexual abuse scandals, either directly as perpetrators or often indirectly defending their friends who are perpetrators over and over again. And I kept tabs on them. I just had some files, and this was before the Me Too movement and Church Too movement, but these stories were out there if you and women were testifying to what had happened to them, and I just kept track. But I was working on another project. I finished that first book on this Methodist woman, Catherine Bushnell, and that actually led me to another research project that I was working on in 2015, and that was about another progressive Methodist woman, Hillary Clinton. And so I was researching the religious formation of Hillary, and particularly situating her in this longer tradition of progressive Methodist social action. And that's where my attention was focused. I kept an eye on what was going on with evangelicals, and I noticed already in 2015, early on, I saw evangelicals, rank and file, start to throw their support behind Donald Trump. Early in the primary season already. And I kept an eye on that, and I thought, okay, that's interesting, slightly unexpected maybe. And then I watched that continue to grow, grassroots first, and only months later, from the top down, men like Jerry Falwell Jr. and Robert Jeffress, and then others slowly came on board. But still, that was not really my focus until October 2016. October 2016, with the release of the Access Hollywood tapes. Remember that? I remember it vividly because I had to do a live national TV interview the day after those tapes released about the Trump-Clinton debate. And I was supposed to be talking about their linguistic style, and that story broke. I thought, you've got to be kidding me. You know, I have no idea what they're going to ask and what I'm going to have to be talking about. They ended up asking me about the software that I used to analyze the speeches. Totally threw me for a loop, but I answered. Aunt Conk, in case you're interested. But anyway, I remember that vividly because we all stopped. We all watched, right? What's going to happen next? Because by that time, we were just weeks away from the 2016 election, and it was clear that white evangelicals were Trump's stalwart supporters. But surely now, family values evangelicals, the moral majority, they cannot continue to support him, right? A few wavered ever so briefly. Within days, they were all back supporting Trump. And I noticed something. I noticed that the language that I heard evangelicals using to justify their support for then-candidate Trump, in light of everything, including Access Hollywood tapes, was exactly what I had been reading all those years ago. The same language about boys will be boys. God filled men with testosterone so that they would have the strength and the aggression necessary to protect faith, family, and nation. And I heard them talking about Trump as their protector. He would not just protect them, he would protect Christianity. Right? He was, in their words, their ultimate fighting champion. And I thought, we've seen this before. Right? I've seen this before in countless cases where abusive leaders are defended and promoted in these spaces. And that's when I thought, I need to set this other research project aside, and I need to pull up those old notes, that old research from all those years ago. And so I did. I wrote up this little piece on white evangelical masculinity and militarism. By that time, Trump had won the election, and so that was published to his time to his inauguration. And it went viral. And at that point, I decided, okay, there's a book here, and I especially wanted to write the book, not just because it went viral, but because I did what you're not supposed to do, and I read the comments. Right? Except most of the comments were not bad ones on this. Most of the comments were evangelical men themselves saying, this is true, and there's so much more here. And so I thought, okay, gonna write this book. So first thing I had to do as a historian is decide where to start. It's always a problem for historians. There's never a clear place to begin. So I knew things really picked up in the 1970s. I knew we had to at least get the 1940s in there with the founding of the National Association of Evangelicals. But then I knew I actually had to go back further, because who are fundamentalists, who are evangelicals? But then I knew I actually had to go back to the 19th century, just very briefly, to show something very important. And that was that things have not always been the way they are now. Really important for historians. This is like our real contribution here to contemporary discourse. Because wherever you find yourself, whatever place, what you're seeing starts to very quickly feel inevitable. This is just the way things are. This is the way God made men to be. This is how Christians are. These are Christian values, right? History's going to mess with that. It doesn't mean everything's relative. It just means things change over time. So I needed to go to the 19th century. Model of warrior masculinity, quite the opposite. Among many American Christians, evangelicals included, it was a vision of gentlemanly restraint. That's what it was to be a Christian man, to hold back that aggression, right? Self-control and self-reliance, right? Now, if you look to the American South, you're going to see a slightly different version there. It's going to match a little bit more, where control was a really important part, and coercive control over women, children, and enslaved people. And so you have more of an honor-based masculinity in the American South. But then you can see over time, this gets to the Teddy Roosevelt era, where North and South come together around a more muscular manhood and a more muscular Christianity. But here, too, things were different. Because in the early 20th century, when Christians suddenly discovered that the American churches had been feminized, this is a perennial discovery if you're a historian of gender and religion, but at that moment, it suddenly was a crisis. Our Christianity is too feminized. We need to re-masculinize the church. We need to take back the church for men, is how they put it. And what's interesting there is that liberal Protestants were as gung-ho in that movement, if not more so, than conservative Protestants. Although you do have your Billy Sundays, who were proponents of this more muscular Christianity across the religious spectrum. And that helped fuel some of this militancy that we see shaping the response to World War I. But there, too, it's not like what you might think today, because in the case of the First World War, liberal Protestants were militaristic, make the world safe for democracy, and they jumped on that bandwagon as Christians. Some conservative Protestants, again, Billy Sunday was one of those who did as well. Many conservative Protestants did not, because they rejected Christian nationalism. Because to be a Christian is to have your soul saved. And a nation doesn't have a soul. And besides, look around you. There's God's country. This is not a Christian nation, right? And so again, things looked very different in the past. And that was very important for me to set up. And where we start to see these strands coming together in a way that we recognize more today is in the 1940s. So I'm going to jump up to that point. In 1942, so a whole bunch of these fundamentalists who, in the wake of the fundamentalist modernist controversies, felt marginalized, excluded. They weren't able to maintain control of their denominations. They had been scattered. They didn't disappear. They were starting Bible colleges and their churches, and they were thriving, but they were scattered. And they came together in 1942 to form the National Association of Evangelicals. They choose the word evangelical because fundamentalists had kind of a bad connotation, backward, angry, cantankerous. And so they rebranded themselves. And they separated off from the most cantankerous fundamentalists. And they had a plan. And they said, we are the faithful remnant of Christians, and we're doing really great things, but we're scattered. Strength in numbers. Let's band together and see what we can do and influence this country. So we need to take to the airwaves, radio programs, and we need to unite our Bible colleges in national organizations, and we need magazines that can reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians across this country. 1942, that was their plan. It was amazing that within 15 years they did it. They did it. They moved from the margins closer to the center. How were they able to do this? In part because the values that they embraced were the values of so many other Americans in the 1940s and the 1950s. What were some of those values? By the late 1940s, evangelicals were embracing gender traditionalism, if you will, male provider, protector, and a domestic ideal for women. And they were embracing, they were staunchly anti-communist, right? Anti-communist. This was the early Cold War era. They had moved from World War II when the National Association of Evangelicals formed, so the good war, militaristic in that respect, and then right into the early Cold War. And communism was anti-God, anti-American, all the things that evangelicals, conservative evangelicals, held dear. But they weren't alone in that, right? This is the consensus era in American history. This was the, post-World War II era. This is the baby boom, the Leave It to Beaver era, right? The GI Bill is helping make these nuclear families in the suburbs possible, at least for the white middle class. So they were right at the center of things, right? And this is when we have Billy Graham really step onto the national stage, in and out of the Eisenhower White House, right? He is their celebrity. And again, where they came from in such short time, it was heady. They had accomplished so much. Everything was going great until the 1960s. Everything fell apart. What happens in the 1960s? Have the civil rights movement, incredibly disruptive for Southern white evangelicals, and a lot of evangelicals were Southerners. And you have the feminist movement starting up, challenging that gender traditionalism. And you have Vietnam and the anti-war movement. Now think about that. All of those things challenging those core values of conservative evangelicals. And what they see is we're no longer in this consensus time. You have a lot of other Americans saying, no, these aren't our values. This is evil, right? This is what we're working against. So you have the anti-war movement, you have civil rights activists. Now, if you think about all of that whereas abortion became a mobilizing issue for conservative evangelicals, it did so only in the late 70s. What came before that was opposing desegregation. And they did so by arguing for parental authority. The parents have the authority, not the government, of who they send, of where they send their kids to school. What they meant was white parents, right? And of the parents, it's the patriarch, it's the father who has the authority in the home. And so things like that so have to be understood in that racialized context. And so evangelicals were doubling down on gender traditionalism, male protector, female homemaker in the 1970s. And they were embracing the US military and the war effort in Vietnam and denouncing those anti-war protesters and proving their patriotism. And this is where we see the beginning of a very tight relationship that forms between conservative evangelicals and the US military that continues to this day. So all of these things are happening, and those core values of evangelicals didn't so much shift as much as they became oppositional, right? So many other Americans were parting ways with them. And so they felt even more that they were the faithful remnant, and it was up to them to protect and defend Christian America. And strong, rugged men were critical to that, providers, protectors, to protect faith, family, and nation. And so that's the story that I then pull through a number of decades of U.S. history. We really see that kind of culminate in the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, which is also the point where we can see the partisan realignment really taking shape, so that all of these values that conservative evangelicals had increasingly by 1980 aligned with one political party, and that was different from critical for understanding recent U.S. political history. But there still are a lot of twists and turns in this story. And in the book, my favorite decade to write about was actually the 1990s. Because all of a sudden, things are up for grabs again. Primarily, I think, because the Cold War had come to an end. And for so long, this anti-communism had really shaped the view of conservative evangelicals. It was kind of this anchor, and everything made sense in light of that, and it was done. And we won, and that was great. But what now? And when I looked to the sources from the 1990s, there was one word that just kept popping up, and that word was confusion. Confusion. What does it mean to be a man anymore? What should we be doing in politics? Maybe without the Cold War, foreign policy, maybe the growing attention to global persecution of Christians, to anti-trafficking activism, anti-poverty work, right? It really felt in the 1990s that things were about to change dramatically. And this is the moment when we have all this confusion that we see the Promise Keepers movement burst onto the scene. Anybody familiar with Promise Keepers? Yeah. Now that caught the eye of the secular media. Tarianism, you could find proponents in there. And not coincidentally, it was also the moment in recent evangelical history where we see real efforts towards racial reconciliation. Again, everything was up for grabs. And so for a time, it felt like things could go in different directions. But what I started to see is voices of resistance from within the fold, saying things are getting too soft. A whole lot of Christian men who participated in the Promise Keepers movement resisted that call for racial reconciliation. In 1996, I believe it was, 40% of complaints that were registered from participants who attended the national meeting said, stop emphasizing racial reconciliation, right? And you see evangelical leaders start to say, it's time for men to step up, right? The Cold War might be done, but there is a war for the soul of America, culture wars, right? And we need to toughen up. And so we have these books written in the late 1990s, in the year 2000, so that they are on the shelves, 2001. Books like Doug Wilson's Future Men, where he promotes a theology of fist fighting for little boys so that boys can grow up to be strong Christian men. We have James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys, where it's all about testosterone. That's key to a boy, who a boy is, and a boy becoming a man. And you have John Eldridge's Wild at Heart. God is a warrior God, and men are made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight. These books were all on the shelves of Christian bookstores when terrorists struck the United States on September 11, 2001. Every man has a battle to fight. It wasn't metaphorical anymore. And what you see is these books, and particularly Eldridge's, resonate so deeply within evangelical spaces, but also far beyond evangelical spaces. And that was the moment when I was first introduced to this, or at least shortly thereafter, in terms of the Iraq War. And that's where we see white evangelicals pushing President Bush, pushing him to engage in this war, telling him, no, just war theory. Don't worry about that. Preemptive war, proactive defense. That's what we need here, right? And then it was like warrior masculinity on steroids for the next few years. This is the era of Mark Driscoll. I don't know if any of you have caught the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast that Christianity Today produced. This is the Driscoll years, right? Deeply crass, crude, abusive. The writings of Doug Wilson, if you haven't read him, don't know who he is, just don't worry about it. Just don't. Right? And another thing that caught my eye as I was looking at what evangelicals were talking about, what they were doing, the same men who were promoting this militant conception of masculinity, the same organizations that were preaching this, were also promoting Islamophobia. And I have a chapter in the book, a very weird chapter, on these fake ex-Muslim terrorists, men who claimed to have been Muslim terrorists and who claimed to have converted to Christianity, and they were all the rage on the Christian-speaking circuit. Some of them are still out there. The thing is, all of them were frauds. And I learned about these guys because one of them came to Calvin back in the day. And my colleague, Doug Howard, who's a historian of the Ottoman Empire and knows a thing or two about Islam, was like, this makes no sense. He's using words that don't exist. And so he did a little digging. And he was able to get a call with Jim Daly, president of Focus on the Family, who was sponsoring this guy, promoting him everywhere. And he found out that they knew he was a fraud. They knew his story didn't check out. Not only his supposed terrorist past, but he also put on his resume that he had played football for the Oklahoma Sooners. He had not played football for the Oklahoma Sooners. Like, all of it completely made up. And when I encountered that, that's when I thought, what is going on here? Because I knew people who had read those books, who had listened to those speakers, and who were terrified at the threat of Islam, that these radical Islamists were coming for families. As James Dobson said, radical Islam is a family values issue because they are coming for your children, right? And I thought, now wait a minute. The whole narrative that I had been hearing in the 2000s, and very much so in 2016, was that evangelical voters were being pushed into the arms of a candidate like Donald Trump because they were so afraid. They were afraid of their religious liberty being taken away. They were afraid of these demographic changes, the end of white Christian America. They were afraid of, in the past, communists, secular humanists. They were afraid of radical Islam. They were afraid of Democrats. They were just so afraid, what choice do they have? And here I suddenly realized, maybe we have to flip that script. What came first, right? The fear or the militancy? And in the case of these fake ex-Muslim terrorists, it seemed like the militancy came first, and the fear was being manufactured by leaders in order to consolidate their own power. And then I started looking back to the history, and I saw the same thing going on at Thomas Road Baptist Church, Jerry Falwell's church. The same thing, manufacturing fear. Don't trust anybody but those on the inside. Don't trust the church down the road. Your faith could be corrupted. Don't trust them. Consolidating the power. I saw how evangelical political organizations flourished whenever a Democrat was in the White House, and they went bankrupt whenever a Republican was. It was harder to gin up that fear and keep the money coming. I looked at Mark Driscoll's church. I saw how at Mars Hill, he literally had bodyguards flanking him and used military language all the time and created this false sense that the world was against him so that he could demand absolute loyalty, and he did. You give me your money, you give me your time, you sacrifice. Anybody who speaks against me or questions me is a traitor. That's how that worked. And so I started to see that evangelical fear was real. It was authentic. But it was also, in some cases, perhaps many cases, manufactured by leaders who stood to gain power from that fear. Anyway, that brings me up to, those are the themes I did not start with as I wrote this book. Those are the themes that I started to pull out as I was writing, which brings me up to 2016 and coming to the realization that the media narratives that I was hearing around the evangelical vote for Donald Trump and the lamenting from among evangelicals, particularly these never Trump evangelicals, right? The famous 81% voted for Donald Trump. That leaves 19% who did not. And from all corners, I kept hearing this talk of betrayal. How could evangelicals betray their values to vote for a man like Trump? And I realized if we have this longer historical narrative, really talking about betrayal. Or we are, but only partial, betraying some of their values. But if we understand this longer history, we can also understand that there is some continuity here. And so that's what ended up being the kind of thesis of the book. Now, I'll wrap up with a few takeaways of some of the lessons that I learned or that I drew out and the narratives that I ended up shaping from this book. And one of the things was this question that I started with the mainstream and the fringe. What is mainstream and what is fringe? And if you read the book, you can see that I'm asking that question over and over as I write. I'm trying to figure it out as I go. And I took a stab at trying to present this as best I could. But I think actually that is one of the most important questions that we need to be asking as we're looking at American religion and politics today. Because the media loves to find the most alarming examples, right? And kind of especially in religious spaces and hold them up and say, you know, like, aren't these guys scary? Aren't these guys ridiculous? And they're going to keep doing that, right? That generates clicks. The question, I think, for those of us who are in religious communities is to ask, what is the relationship between some of those extremist figures and the mainstream? And that's something that I teased out in this book in various ways. My chapter on Bill Gothard and James Dobson. I'm not sure how much Gothard is in these spaces. Anybody familiar with Gothard? Okay, I see lots of people. Oh, yes. See, when I started to write this book, I had no intention of including Gothard. None. He was fringe. Total fringe. I was not going to discredit my book by pointing to him, because I knew people would say, oh, you're just going for the extremes, right? And time and again, when I was talking with people about this book, even fellow historians, oh, what's your next book on? And I'd say, Evangelical Masculinity and Militarism. And they'd say, you are looking at Bill Gothard, aren't you? I'd be like, no. And so what I did, I looked at him and I saw He reached millions of people directly through his seminars, and tens of millions, hundreds of millions, possibly more, through people who were inspired, influenced by him. But what I did is I kept him fringe. I said, he's not mainstream. But now let's look at James Dobson. Undeniably mainstream. They are not the same, but their teachings on authority, on patriarchy, on hierarchy, on discipline, there's a lot of overlap there. And those are the things I'm trying to tease out. Take somebody like Mark Driscoll, misogynistic, crude, crass, Doug Wilson, arguably even worse, and a blatant racist. Then you see how, and he would be deeply offended if anybody called him mainstream evangelical, Doug Wilson. He'd be really upset. But in the 2000s, he was platformed by Christianity Today. He was defended by John Piper, invited on the stage with John Piper. These are the mainstream evangelical figures, right? That's one of the things I was trying to tease out of this narrative. What is the relationship between the mainstream and the fringe? And for those evangelicals today who are saying, we don't like where this movement has gone, in pointing to, if you read the New York Times, evangelical saviors trying to save evangelicals from themselves. Part of the problem with that narrative, and yes, I'm in there, I know I don't identify as an evangelical for the record, but anyway, if you look at that, the point of my book is actually the complicity, the cooperation between the mainstream and the fringe, which is important not for assigning blame, not at all. It's important if you want to extremes, right? To really to have a thorough reckoning with how we got to where we are now. A couple of other takeaways here. Another thing that I became convinced of was how deference functioned in evangelical spaces. And I don't know if it's the same in your tradition or not, but what I saw is time and again that perpetrators of abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, were defended by their communities. And it was the victims, the survivors, who were kicked out, who were marginalized. And I started to see patterns of behavior, the absolute requirement to show deference to those who held power. And as I saw that, I first recognized that in cases of abuse, and then I saw that as a larger cultural practice. And it looks really righteous. You feel righteous. You're deferring to those with more authority. But I ultimately, as a Christian, started to ask, is authority the heart of the gospel? And is enforcing authority really what it is to be Christian? Is that the way of Christ? Because as I read the scriptures, Jesus kind of upended social hierarchies and religious authority structures, right? He turned everything on its head, and he was not what anybody expected him to be, the Messiah, right? And so I made an intentional choice at some point not to participate in that deference to those with power. And that's how you get the chapter titles, and that's how you get the subtitle, and that's part of what I was doing. It was intentional. And then I'll say one more thing before wrapping up. Actually, I'll skip that, and I'll wrap up. I want to make sure we have time for questions. What I will say is, okay, so the book published these are the decisions that went into the book. This is the story that came out of it. The book published back in June 2020. Much to my surprise, and even more so perhaps to my publisher's surprise, because my publisher is completely out of this whole Christian world, the book was embraced by conservative evangelicals. If you read the book, you know I did not write the book to woo evangelicals. But what I saw happening very early on was evangelicals saying, this is the story of my life. In fact, the book debuted, launched with the help of Morning Edition, NPR, like writer's dream. Within 2 days of that, I started getting letters from readers in my inbox, messages, testifying, people entire life histories. I went to Gothard seminars. I went to the Wild at Heart retreats. I was a pastor that promoted this. I did this all, and everything you say is true. But I never understood how all these pieces fit together. I still, almost 2 years out, I get about a dozen messages a day from readers. And then what I saw happening is some of these, let me just say, not all conservative evangelicals are fans. I'll put that out there. There's some objections that come my way, some pushback. If you're on Twitter, you know. But my favorite readers are conservative, white, evangelical pastors. And they're the ones, I like to say this, if there's a conservative evangelical man who does not have a podcast, I probably haven't met him. Because they started taking this book and inviting me onto their podcasts, inviting me into their spaces, into their adult Sunday schools. And they had my back. And they would say, you know, sometimes they didn't even have to say this, but I knew it. We don't agree on everything here. But they understood what was at the heart of this book, which was not dismantling their faith. It was helping them to be more faithful Christians, even more faithful conservative, white, evangelical complementarians. And I absolutely love them, and just kudos to all of those evangelical men who have stepped up in their spaces and continue to grapple with this book and to invite others into that. And so that's where I'll wrap things up. I ended up my acknowledgments. If you make it all the way through the book, you'll see, I think, so many people who have supported me in this work despite our differences, and for the grace that so many have shown to engage in conversation around things that matter. And so thank you for welcoming me here in that spirit, and I'm happy to take your questions.
So I'm going to start here because I've solicited some questions from our faculty, and we had your book as a faculty book club right after it came out. And so I know that several of my colleagues, we had some great discussions, created some great discussions on this campus, which was a catalyst for this lecture. One quick question, though, before any of the other questions, and I think this is coming back to you being a teacher and an educator. And I know we have some students that are history majors that are here. You know, why study history, and what advice would you have to some of our students who are thinking and aspiring? Maybe we have a future Kristen Dumais that's going to write the sequel to Jesus and John Wayne. What advice would you have?
That'd be awesome. The wonderful thing about being a historian is you can study anything, because everything has a history to it, right? So I studied Christian feminism first, then I was going to write about the religious formation of Hillary Clinton, and then this happened, and so now I wrote a book on evangelical masculinity and militarism, and now I'm going to be writing a book on Hallmark movies and inspirational fiction. And but what you do then, I was just telling a couple of people about my next book, and it's going to delve much deeper into economics, and showing how these, even like Christian romance, I'm not supposed to talk about this book, but this isn't on video, is it? I think we're good. How this, sorry, publicist rules, but how these books and films are presenting a vision of femininity, domesticity, kind of obvious, but also economics, libertarianism, neoliberalism, things like that. And I was just telling like other people this, and like, oh, right, you could take something that we all know, that we all see, that we all interact with, and you can say, now let's look at what's really going on here and how we're being shaped and formed in ways that we may not even realize. And when we're talking about Christian popular culture, how our faith is being formed and discipled in ways that we may not be attentive to. So that's what I love about history. It shows how things came to be, and maybe we think, great, we love where we're at, but if we don't, then we can have some clues as to how to take a few steps back and try again.
So, talking about some of the pushback you've had, some of the pushback.
Yes.
Is there anything you would change about your book? I mean, being a writer.
Yeah,
and,
I love that question. And I can tell everybody who's chuckling, you're on Twitter, and everybody who's just sitting there quietly, probably not. So, I've gotten some pushback. What was interesting is I got very little pushback for the first several months. I think the strategy was ignore it and it will go away. And then that backfired eventually. Would I change anything? Oh, this is going to sound really obnoxious. No, I wouldn't. I mean, I get a lot of pushback on the subtitle. It took us 3 months to come up with it. So one thing about this book, and I don't use this as an excuse, just an explanation, because I'm very happy with the choices I made, but it's a trade publisher. That's how you get a book launched on NPR, right? That's how you get this kind of publicity behind it. And they have rules. They have a lot of rules. And one of the rules, this will be painful for you, I had to take out every historian's name from my manuscript. I could not name another historian in it. They're like, you know what? No person who's not a historian wants to read debates among historians. And that was painful, right? Like, how do you do this?
I'm feeling the pain.
Exactly. That was where I was like, I told my editor, like, okay, but this guy actually coined this term. I need to put his name in here. And he said, coin your own terms, Kristen. I mean, that's how it was. So there were rules. When it came to the subtitle, my editor and I disagreed. It took us months. And then finally we had one. It was something about white evangelicals and the cult of masculinity. And we were like popping the champagne, or metaphorically, like celebrating. We finally did it. And he came back, and a sales team has a say, and they said no. Both masculinity and militarism are not allowed because they're too long. Okay. And this sounds like, okay, this is my book about masculinity and militarism. What do I do? And so I ended up saying, what is this book ultimately about? And who needs to know? And I thought, it's about, it matters for all Americans. That's the second part. Fractured a nation. But it also matters for evangelicals, even though they are not my primary audience, and they're certainly not my publisher's primary audience. But I wanted to speak to evangelicals on their own terms, and that corrupted of faith is not a historical claim, it's a theological one. It's me saying, on your own terms, let's look at this biblical literalism. What about turn the other cheek? What about love your enemies? What about the traditional doctrine of the Trinity? What about these things? On your own terms, let's take another look at the scriptures. And I will say they gave me the choice between transformed of faith or corrupted of faith. I was the one who suggested corrupted because I thought transformation can be a good thing, and I want to be very clear that I don't actually think this is a good thing. Yeah. Okay,
citing you, so but it's not a trade book, so.
Right. It was painful. It was very painful.
And by the way, this may be of interest to our audience here. For an Adventist audience, I read your book, and my next book's on the 1920s and Adventism and fundamentalism, and I had to add a chapter, and I'm calling it Muscular Adventism. Yes. Because all the things that you talk about Teddy Roosevelt, Adventists are saying if Adventist young people, the ideal Adventist man was Teddy Roosevelt. It wasn't some other religious figure. It was Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah. And then if more Adventist young men could be virile like him, Jesus would come.
Oh, wow. So you could bring the second coming.
Right,
wow.
Right.
Add that to it, yes.
So anyways, I'm diverging a little bit, but I love this, but I am giving you credit for this, so it's not a trade publication.
They're in the footnotes, as we said. Effusive praise in the footnotes,
right, yes. It's there. All right. Recent articles, including one from NPR yesterday, suggest that an ideological sorting is underway in the United States in which people are moving to different states and zip codes to live closer to their quote-unquote tribe. Yeah. Many, and this is from a colleague here, myself included, see this as a concerning trend as it promotes ideological tunnel vision. Now, your book already addresses this in a way, such as in the chapter in Colorado Springs, though this is usually framed as a political movement. Can you comment on the intersection of that movement and the threads of your book?
Yeah, we see this sorting. We see this sorting throughout American Christianity. My guess is you feel it in your own denomination too, right? That the things that ought to matter most and hold us together don't. And our identity ends up being more primarily defined by our political allegiances. This is not new. This is a trend that sociologists have been pointing us to for about 3 decades now, I think at least. And I think it's a real challenge for people of faith. Right? I just came from a conference at Truett on racism and white Christianity. And it's a tough topic because the statistics are damning. White Christians are the most racist Americans, hands down. White evangelicals top the charts, then come, white mainline and Catholics, not too far behind, right? And their views on all kinds of issues, their racism index, off the charts compared to non-church-going Americans, compared to everybody else. And at the same time, we have hope, or we must have hope, because our faith says that this is wrong. Our faith says that we are called to unity and that we all need healing. And this is not about guilt. It may be about confession, but this is kind of what we do as Christians, right? And we bring it to the cross, and we seek redemption, and we seek shalom. And so we have the tools. We have the tools. And the thing is, these divisions run through our families, don't they? They run through our colleges. They run straight through our churches. I'm speaking as all of that is true for me. All of that is true for me. So we are well positioned. It is hard work, but we are well positioned to refuse to let these things pull us apart. All right. So one of the things that I do practically is I try to grab people to my left and to my right politically who I know have them, right? And that's what we're doing for each other here. And I think if we could all do that more, we could hold on to each other.
So I'd like you to comment a little bit. You talk about the other in your book, this othering, and at various times the Cold War, Islamophobia, your chapter that you mentioned. And while that's still present, it doesn't seem to be quite the same danger it was after September 11, what you mentioned. Do you see a clearly defined other now, and what would that be?
Yeah, it's your political opponent right now, right? It's moved. It's not out there, although it is, if you want to look at immigration, but really it's moved internal. And it always has been both, right? There's always the actual wars and the culture wars. But the focus really in the last 10 years, I would say since 2008, I think we can say, the enemy is within. Yeah.
Come back to this idea of talking about, we've got a number of aspiring women who want to serve as pastors, come from a tradition that encourages that. But we also have elements both in the broader culture and even within our tradition itself that perpetuate these strong views against women in ministry, that sort of thing. And of course, you have women that feel this sense of calling, and we're at the intersection of one of those places where that happens. What advice would you have for these women?
Oh, it can be tough, but also you are in a long tradition of Christian women who have done tough things because they felt called by Christ. Right? And that's what I discovered as a historian, and that's part of the story of my first book. I knew none of that. I didn't know that was part of my heritage as a Christian. I only thought that women in ministry was a feminist thing, a very recent invention. I was shocked, oh wow, it goes way back. And then what really did it for me was reading women's diaries from the 19th and 20th century female pastors who were they were giving up everything. One woman, Madeline Southard, a Methodist woman, who deeply, deeply wanted to be a mother, agonizing, reading her diary entries, but she felt called to the ministry, and she knew that made her unattractive to the average man, that she knew that she was she for years struggled, and prayed, and never ended up getting married, never had kids, and went on to open the offices of the Methodist Church to women. And I just read those diaries, and this is not liberal drift here. This is deep, soul-searching, sacrificial, following God. And so I think looking to history, looking to those around us as well in our own time who are following Christ in self-sacrificial ways.
So my last question is a very simple question. I think reading your critics, both within our tradition and outside of our tradition, and just I've read fairly widely and been following you on Twitter, and so I've seen some of those critics. But it seems to me one of the most obvious criticisms people come for is sort of the jugular, well, if you write these things and you're critiquing the Christian church, how can you be a Bible-believing Christian?
Yeah. Right, because we are not supposed to air our dirty laundry, right? We're supposed to cover that up. That was my instinct, remember? That's why I didn't write this book 15 years ago. It felt like a noble choice at the time. It really did, right? I'm not an ambulance chaser here. We don't need to shine a light on this. So I participated in it. I helped facilitate it when I could have said something. I'm not like feeling an overwhelming amount of guilt. I just am acknowledging that I too had that instinct, right? But my absolute favorite quote in the book is from Rachel Denhollander. I don't know if you know who she is. She was the first witness in the case of sexual abuse USA Gymnastics against Larry Nassar. And then she also, at that time, she's getting all this kind of media attention. She said, and you know what? I'm an evangelical. And speaking up against abuse in evangelical spaces cost her and her husband their church. And she said it's the least safe place to call out abuse is American evangelicalism, right? And in her witness statement, which I quote in my last chapter of my book, she has this beautiful quote, which really is the moral center of Jesus and John Wayne. It says, Jesus does not ask for our protection. Jesus asks for our obedience. And what does obedience look like? Telling the truth and doing justice. And that is it, right? And so that's how I'd respond. We need to tell the truth and we need to do justice. And God will take care of God's church. Always has, right? And our job is to follow Christ. That would be my answer.
So the verse that came to mind as I listened to you is speaking the truth in love.
Yes.
And so would you join me in thanking Dr. Dumais for this lovely afternoon?
Thank you.
Let's close with a word of prayer. If you bow your heads with me. Father God, we're grateful for the opportunity to be challenged to think carefully about the past. I thank you for Dr. Dumais and her research and her books, and I just pray that it will probe our hearts to think more carefully and to become more committed in our own Christian faith, and that we will do so in a way that will build up your kingdom for your honor and glory. So bless each and every one, and thank you for this time and space that we've had together. We pray and ask your blessing in Christ's name. Amen. You're dismissed. Thank you so much. Dr. Dumais will be here for just a few minutes. She does have another appointment, so she can't stay long, but she'll be up here for